Tonight, the retrial begins.
This court is in session. Please be seated.
2282 CR 117, the Commonwealth versus Karen Reed.
The jury hears each side's narrative in a case that has divided Massachusetts.
She said, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him.
There was no collision with John O'Keefe.
The defendant is the same, but the lawyers delivering open statements are not. Why this high-profile retrial already feels different from a year ago. Plus, fiery exchanges as the first witnesses take the stand.
That your memory is better now than it was a year ago when you testified about the exact same circumstance, correct?
Yes, sir.
How this first responder's second time on the stand is impacting the case in a whole new way. Canton Confidential, the Karen Reed murder trial, starts right now.
Karen Reed's retrial is underway with opening statements, and what unfolded today inside court is just a peek at what we can expect in the coming weeks. Good evening, everyone. I'm J.C. Monahan.
And I'm Glenn Jones. Hank Brennan and Alan Jackson faced off in Norfolk Superior Court. Special Prosecutor Brennan began making the case against Karen Reed, while Jackson told the jury his client is not to blame for John O'Keefe's death.
Right after opening statements, two witnesses took the stand. We heard from paramedic Timothy Nuttall and Carrie Roberts, a friend of John O'Keefe. Both were there as first responders worked on O'Keefe that January day in 2022.
And after the jury left for the day, Judge Beverly Canoni scheduled a hearing on the defense team's accident reconstruction experts from ARCA. That's set for Friday. ARCA will be in court for that. The judge set the hearing because of what she calls reciprocal discovery violations.
All right, that is Friday. NBC 10's Melody Mendez joining us now live in Dedham. She'll be joining us throughout the trial. Melody, what was it like outside the courthouse here on day one?
JC, it's different. Everything about this case so far has been very different. Inside, as you just heard moments ago, inside the courthouse, the opening statements were different. The attorneys delivering them were different. And outside here, perhaps the most obvious difference to onlookers is the scene outside the courthouse, because it is a far cry from what we saw during the first trial. Walk with me for just a second, and I'm going to help explain why this might be the case. So we are walking to the beginning of what's called a buffer zone. Essentially, Judge Beverly Canoni has extended a 200-foot buffer zone in every direction from this courthouse. Last time around, all of these sidewalks were filled with supporters of Karen Reed, with folks on both sides of the case. Quite frankly, they were wearing pink T-shirts. They brought televisions. They brought laptops. They had set up essentially what looked almost like a tailgate, and it became, by all accounts, a circus here outside the courthouse. But look at this. They've got these barricades up. It is quiet out here. There is nobody in this area because they're not allowed to be this time around. Now, as we keep walking to the edge of this buffer zone, I also want to talk about another major difference, and that's the gag order. Because last time around, we heard a lot from the defense attorneys for Karen Reed. The gag order that's been put in place by Judge Beverly Canoni this time around prevents those attorneys from speaking to the media. So they cannot speak. Karen Reed herself, she is allowed to speak, but she's been speaking far less than she did the first time around. She stopped at the bottom of the courthouse steps as she left the courthouse today, and she did answer one question from the media. Here's what she had to say.
I feel great. Today went well. We prepped hard, and I'm just proud of my team. I can't be prouder, and I feel fortunate to have them, and we've got the truth, so we just forge ahead.
Okay, so finally, we've made it here to the beginning of the buffer zone. This is the sign that they have put up, but just take a look. My photographer Alex is going to pan out so you can see just how far we are now from the courthouse and from the media. This perhaps explains, right, why it is a far calmer scene playing out here so far during this trial. That is the distance that folks have to stay from this trial, and that was where much of the chaos played out the last trial. Guys, for now, back to you.
Melanie, thank you for showing all of that to us. It gave us an excellent look at how things are different this time around. When you talk to law enforcement, do they see this time as more business as usual, whereas last time it was really a spectacle?
Yeah, Glenn, it's a great question. And no, it is not at all business as usual. I mean, take a look over here. There are barricades for miles around this courthouse set up. There are no parking signs for miles in Dedham around this courthouse. There is nothing usual or normal about this. I did speak to several law enforcement sources today, though. They told me they did have a bigger police presence outside the courthouse today and enforcing these buffer zones. I spoke to one officer on his bicycle who said he was actually very surprised by how calm it was today outside the courthouse, and he's hoping things stay that way. Of course, we'll have to wait and see how that goes. But the bottom line is, no, it is not business as usual. Nothing is normal around here. The media is everywhere. Law enforcement are everywhere. Barricades are everywhere. For now, live in Dedham, Melody Mendez, NBC 10 Boston. Back to you.
Natalie, thank you very much.
Let's bring in NBC 10 Chief Legal Analyst Michael Coyne to break down opening statements. Hank Brennan, right off the bat, clear he has a very different style from Adam Lally, who led the prosecution the first time. We're going to listen into a clip from Brennan today compared to Adam Lally last year. Take a listen.
At 6:04 a.m. on January 29, 2022, the alarm bell sounded in the Canton Fire Department. Firefighter paramedic Timothy Nuttall knew what that meant.
We start with John O'Keefe. John O'Keefe grew up in Braintree. He was 46 years old when he passed.
Okay, let's start, Michael, with a few things that I noticed. First off, he has a different physical style. He's walking, he's talking, he's not using notes. Adam Lally, a lot of notes stood, behind the podium. In the end, he said the data will prove the case. He talked about the black box from Reed's car, John's phone. And I also noticed he downplayed John O'Keefe as a police officer. Yes, he was a police officer, but he was so much more. He was a friend. He was a family man. He was an uncle. Slightly, it felt like distancing himself from this narrative that we keep. It's almost automatic. Boston police officer John O'Keefe. Do you think that Brennan accomplished what he needed to today in opening?
I do. And I think there was a deliberate reason why you would distance yourself from law enforcement. The back the blue defense here that the defendant asserts from time to time. What you want to do is humanize the victim, to really have the jurors be able to see him as a person, not think that his occupation defines him, and especially as a law enforcement officer. He's an uncle, he's a dad, he's taking care of these kids. It was difficult to listen to parts of that opening where you really did start to get a recognition that this was a good life lost as a result of horrible events that night.
Let's turn to the defense now. Same as the prosecution, a switch was made for the retrial. Alan Jackson took over from his colleague David Yannetti. Here's a look at how the two handled opening statements differently.
Above everything else, 3 points. There was no collision with John O'Keefe. There was no collision. There was no collision.
Karen Reed was framed. Her car never struck John O'Keefe. She did not cause his death. And that means that somebody else did.
So you see there, Jackson started his opening statement more from a science base, whereas, of course, Yannetti famously said she was framed when he started. So it seems like maybe Jackson is setting up his narrative more around a reasonable doubt case than the third-party culprit defense. And that's something that you're saying you thought was a good idea to do.
Yeah, and I think it should be done. Frankly, what you want to avoid in opening statements is promising something you can't deliver. Because the other side will hold you to those promises when it comes to closing arguments and say, he promised you this, he promised you this, he promised you this, and he didn't deliver any of that. And I do worry, though, still, even with this new tilt on the defense, that they've promised some things that I'm not sure they're going to be able to deliver.
Like what?
Well, I don't know how they're going to prove he actually went into the house, unequivocally prove, that's what his language was, he went into the house. He also said that, and he spent some time in the opening statement to develop this, that she never, ever said, I hit him. And then the first thing we see right before Kerry Roberts' testimony is her acknowledging to one of the documentary makers, yeah, I said I hit him, but I didn't think I said it as often as they said. That's, to me, very impactful. And especially now, you've got a couple of promises made that you may not be able to deliver on. The jury's going to hold us to our promises that we make in opening, so it needs to be very carefully done.
All right, another sign that things were different. The first person to take the witness stand was Canton paramedic Timothy Nuttall. Here's a look at his direct examination.
And when you looked up and saw that person and asked about any background, what did she say to you?
I hit him, I hit him, I hit him.
When you're helping a patient, do you have any interest in detective work?
No, sir.
Do you have any interest in investigating potential crimes?
At that time, in this particular instance, because I was at the airway, that is a pretty critical aspect of a cardiac arrest. I was stuck there. I couldn't get up and kind of follow up on that at all. I was there doing that ventilation.
Is it your job to investigate cases or simply to get information to help treatment?
Just the information.
Yeah, this seems to start the narrative that what we saw in the first trial was, well, if someone heard Karen Read say, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him, why didn't that get passed along when John O'Keefe was brought to the hospital, to other first responders, to police officers? It seems to me right there, he was really making it clear with Nuttall that it was, unless it had something to do with the care that he could give John O'Keefe in that moment, he really didn't care.
And you and I have discussed that. You know, if it's our loved one lying in that snow, we want the first responders there to try to save him first. Forget about investigating the crime that may or may not have taken place, but put whatever efforts you have into saving the life of our loved one. And that's what I thought that testimony brought out very clearly. Is the
we didn't get that last time.
No, we did not.
We did not get that.
But hang on, because on cross-examination, Nuttall's memory is really tested here by Alan Jackson. Let's listen.
How many times you previously testified that you heard the phrase, I hit him?
So previously testified possibly to 2, but it was 3.
Okay. Your memory is clearer now than it was, for instance, a year ago when you testified.
Repeat that?
Sure. Your memory is clearer now, as you sit here, that it was 3 times you heard that, than it was a year ago when you testified that it was 2 times.
Yes, sir.
NBC 10 courtroom insider Sue O'Connell has joined the conversation now. You were in the courtroom. You heard that testimony. How did he stand up on cross as you're observing the jury listening to him?
Well, there was already one juror who was kind of making a face and chuckling because there was just this effort by Alan Jackson to match what he believed this witness was saying against the video that we had watched. There was a little bit of confusion about the first video. Was it time-stamped? Was it not time-stamped? We all got a little worried we're going to have a time-stamp problem again. But it was really a struggle because he just didn't stick to the story that Alan Jackson was telling the jury that they were watching on the video. Of course, we know the jurors aren't going to get to go back and watch the video again. And in fact, when they suggested perhaps we could watch it, the judge said, no, we're not going to watch it. So already we had confusion that was being sowed with the jury.
Sue O'Connell, Michael Coyne, thank you. When we come back in just a few minutes, Canton Confidential, the Karen Read murder trial, will dig deeper into some of the new evidence we are just learning about in this case. A legal expert joins us for a look at what this could mean for the retrial.
Don't miss any of the Karen Read murder trial. Get the full recap of what happened in court, expert analysis, and what we could see next. This is coverage you won't see anywhere else. Canton Confidential, weeknights at 7 on NBC 10 Boston.
Now, when he's in the car, before he gets to Fairview, the battery temperature of that phone is 77 degrees. 77 degrees in the warm car. Now that he's been outside the car for 5 minutes, it drops to 72 degrees.
And speaking of DNA, the evidence will further establish that John O'Keefe's shoe, the one that he was wearing when he was found, was sampled. And that DNA revealed 5, count them, 5 unidentified males.
Today, the prosecution and defense alluded to new evidence we did not hear about in the first trial. This is just yet another example of how the trial is already shaping up to be different.
So let's dive a little bit deeper into this by bringing in a legal expert. Joining us for the very first time, we want to welcome in Michigan-based attorney Martin Radner. He's covering the trial on his YouTube channel, Brother Counsel. Martin, thank you for being with us. Give us your take on opening statements.
Well, I mean, the first thing is that I wish Brennan would have stood a little bit closer to the microphone so we could have heard him a little better, like Alan Jackson. But I will say that, I mean, I think if you watch the first trial and you compare Adam Lalley's opening statement to Hank Brennan's opening statement, I mean, Hank obviously did, I think, a better job. He's a better storyteller. He told the story. He told it from the perspective of Timothy Nuttall, which eventually led to what he would call a confession by Karen Reed. However, I would say that he made some critical strategic mistakes, which Alan Jackson absolutely capitalized on during his opening statement. And if you don't know already, I mean, what I'm talking about is the mistakes that he made, not talking about Michael Proctor, not talking about the Google search. One of the things that you have to do when you're going first is you have to anticipate what is the other side going to say, and you make sure to dispel any argument and make sure that you spin it in the way that you want the jury to hear it, not the way that they're going to hear it from a guy like Alan Jackson. So that was a critical, strategic, terrible mistake that Hank Brennan made. I think he should have addressed it. And Alan Jackson also made some mistakes. I think the way that he buckled down was saying that she never said, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. You know, there can be explanations to why she said it, but to say it so strongly, you know, you're digging yourself in a little bit of a hole there, because we're going to hear testimony about that, perhaps even her own statements. So, you know, there's some mistakes on both sides, but I think that really is really critical. The jury just heard it from Alan Jackson himself, and he framed it the way that he wanted. Michael Proctor, you know how hard it is to get fired from being a state police, and he did it. He earned it, dishonorably discharged, and that's how the jury hears it. And, you know, there's no taking that away. So
he called him a cancer. I mean, he literally used that word, that Proctor is a cancer to this trial. We touched on new evidence like the phone battery temperature, right, Glenn?
Mm-hmm. And we're intrigued by that because that's something we didn't hear at all in the first trial. What do you think about that aspect of the case going forward, and what other new evidence we might see in this second trial?
Yeah, well, we definitely know that Hank Brennan is very sold on this battery stuff. He kept talking about it in his opening statement, kept coming back to the battery. So that's going to be, it seems like, a focal point of his case this time around. Something that, you're right, we did not hear anything about the first trial. So that's going to be interesting how he tries to tie that data points into proving his case beyond a reasonable doubt. I think that another point, which we heard from Alan Jackson this time around also, which is going to be very interesting, as we're going to see a much more of a battle of the experts this time, is Dr. Elizabeth LaPasta, who apparently, and I hope I'm saying her name right, but apparently she's going to testify that against kind of the neurosurgeon who's going to testify for the Commonwealth, that this blunt force trauma to the back of John O'Keefe's head happened because he fell backwards onto frozen ground. And she's going to completely contradict that by saying that this injury could have only been from a raised or ledged surface. So that's going to be very interesting, that battle of the experts right there, and the cross-examination on these two experts.
Martin, you know, when we approached this second trial, I think many of us were figuring we were going to see a repeat of what we saw the first time around. I know we're only one day into this, but it feels like we're dealing with a completely new trial. I mean, all the players are the same, but the way the evidence and the arguments are being presented feels so different.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I saw this from coming, you know, from months before already. I knew that this trial was going to be very different. I saw the way Hank Brennan was preparing this trial. I saw, you know, he's going to be adding experts. It seemed like that way. So I knew we were going to have some of the same. Obviously, we're going to hear Kerry Roberts. We're going to hear Jennifer McCabe. We're going to hear a lot of the same. But there's definitely going to be some different parts of this trial. I've been saying, you know, for months now on my channel, definitely should go, I'll check it out. But I've been saying that this trial is going to be very different, I think, this time around, Karen Reed trial 2.0, than it was that we saw last year.
Well, it definitely feels that way, for sure. And we will absolutely check out your YouTube channel, which I just want to make sure I get right. Brother Counsel, correct?
That's it.
That's it. Martin Radner, thank you.
Thank you.
We really appreciate a fresh look at this case. We want to bring back, however, our constant here, Michael Coyne, Sue O'Connell. Let's wrap up with just like an overall take of day one, Michael.
If it's a heavyweight fight, it's 10-9 for the prosecution. But the prosecution should start out on a strong day because likely these are two of their strongest witnesses. They set the tone for the rest of the trial, and I think they've done just that. Obviously, the defense will have days as well, but I think today you have to give the victory to the prosecution. But it's very, very early.
And Sue, you were in the courtroom. Not many people are. What's the mood?
It's a very different experience, as Melody was talking about the outside and the inside. It was very somber inside. Michael and I were talking earlier. It actually felt like a murder trial this time. All of Karen Reed's family and supporters were wearing dark colors, blacks, blues, only one pink shirt. You might remember at the beginning of the last trial, people were wearing pink and were excited to be in there. Obviously, John O'Keefe's family and friends were in there wearing dark colors as well. And because of the sheer number of lawyers who are on Karen's team this time, it's very crowded inside. We also have brand new screens that are up in the courtroom, and there's also a feeling of a heavy security, which I don't think is necessarily related to Karen Reed trial, but just basically the feeling about judges and courts in the United States right now. So it definitely was serious, anxious, somber, and filled with gravitas.
Here we go, day one. Michael and Sue, as always, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Just a quick reminder about our coverage. Remember to join us here on Canton Confidential, the Karen Reed murder trial, every weeknight at 7 o'clock. We will have a full recap of the latest developments from court, as well as you just heard, our legal analysis.
And if you have any questions about this case, send them our way. We've got the email up on our screen, canton.confidential@nbcuni.com. We'll answer as many questions as we can. You're watching Canton Confidential, the Karen Reed murder trial.